For the last 7 weeks, we've been following a guy by the name of Paul and the significant moments in his life. It started with Paul as this really just larger than life religious leader for the Jewish people in the first century. He was a Pharisee, which is one of the three main categories of religious leaders. You have scribes, you have Pharisees. The idea that this crew, the Sadducees, this crew of Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes, they would make up what we know today as the Sanhedrin. It's the governing body for everything Jewish. It was in and around Jerusalem. The temple was a huge deal. It was a center of life. Paul was a significant member of that leading class in the first century. Paul had an enormous, in terms of what the Bible would call zeal for his faith, for the temple, for Torah, for the Jewish way of life. And so part of that zeal that he had, that zealousness, was that he would stop at nothing to protect that which he loved the most, which was temple, Torah, Yahweh, Jehovah. And so when the movement of Jesus started and really started picking up some momentum, he saw it as his personal opportunity to express that zealousness in his heart, the desire that he had. And so he wanted to put a stop to that Jesus movement. And in doing so, he went well beyond what most of us would say is an acceptable form of stopping power, right? Like we can understand, like maybe protesting, maybe having a conversation, maybe even shouting someone down on Facebook. We can get that. But Paul went so far as to arrest people for their religious beliefs. And Paul went so far not only to arrest them, he oversaw the execution of people that followed Jesus. The first one that we know of is a man named Stephen. And so he oversees this. He takes his show on the road from Jerusalem to a place called Damascus, where he had received letters of authority to go do the same thing in Damascus he was doing in Jerusalem, which was to capture, to eliminate those who would follow Jesus. On the way to Damascus, he has an encounter with Jesus himself. And Jesus simply asks him a question: why do you persecute me? It changes Paul's life. Paul completely shifts gears from following this Jewish heritage into surrendering his life to what completes the Jewish narrative, which is the Messiah, the Christ, the Savior in Jesus Christ himself. He gives his life to him. And he takes that zealousness and he puts it into not stopping the church, but starting them. Now, it takes a little over a decade from that moment where he comes in contact with Jesus face to face. It takes about a decade for him to get into a place where he becomes decently useful. It starts with a mentor of his. His name is Barnabas, and Barnabas invites him to this vibrant new work of God that's happening in Syrian Antioch. This church is kind of exploding. We'll throw it on the map so you can kind of see what we're talking about. This church is exploding not with Jewish folks, but people who have no Jewish heritage whatsoever. And in Syrian Antioch, the people are just starting to follow Jesus. They're falling in love with the idea of having a Savior and forgiveness and grace. And so this movement starts, and they need someone who has a lot of experience and knowledge about the Jewish heritage, because there's none in Syrian Antioch. So Barnabas recruits Paul and says, hey, will you come and teach here? Will you come and inspire and disciple? And so he does. And so he spends about a year there. The church explodes. It just grows and grows and grows. So much so, they're like, hey, Barnabas, Paul, thank you so much for your time. You should go do this other places. And that kickstarts an idea that says, hey, maybe we shouldn't wait for churches to get started and then show up. Maybe we should show up and help churches get started. So they leave Syrian Antioch and they go to the home island of Barnabas, Paul's mentor. And they go to Cyprus, and they start on the east side of the island. They talk a little bit there. They go to the west side of the island from Salamis to Paphos, and they spend some time there. But that's still home turf, right? Barnabas is well known there. Everything is kind of like, it just feels at home. It's time for them to actually go a little further to start a missionary journey, is what we would call it today. And so they leave the home turf of his mentor Barnabas, and they go north into what we know today as modern day Turkey, to the port of Perga. They don't do anything in Perga other than get off the boat. And then they go north from Perga to Pisidian Antioch. Same word, Antioch. There was quite a few Antiochs at the time. One's back in Syria. This one is not in Syria. This is modern-day Turkey. It's in Pisidia. So Pisidian Antioch was a new city for Rome. It was where soldiers who had fought in the Roman conquest were given land as a gift, as a thank you from the nation. It says, hey, appreciate you giving everything. We're going to give you some land. So it's full of military veterans, slap full of them. And he goes there and he finds a synagogue and he begins to teach. And he begins to teach and teach and teach. And people are like excited about it. Like, this is incredible what you're telling us. But eventually there's some Jewish folks and some folks that are from the local region that are not Jewish, some Greeks, that are like, hey, actually, we think you're full of nonsense. And so we're not happy about this. And so the way they dealt with it 2,000 years ago is if they disagreed with you and they couldn't prove you wrong, then they would just execute you. And so that's what they started to plan. They were going to plan to execute him. And he got word of it, and so they got out of the city. They go from Pisidian Antioch, they go a little bit east to Iconium. Iconium, a very different city, not settled with military veterans. This one settled with agricultural folks. Rich farmland, still known as the Garden of Asia Minor, even today. And so it's a very different city, but he goes in, still invests. The same thing happens. People are excited. People are giving their lives to Jesus. But there's this Jewish leadership and Greek leadership that it just doesn't sit well. Everything that Paul is talking about continues to undo their way of life. Eventually, they get to the same place that Pisidian Antioch got. And they said, hey, if we can't shut him up, we'll just kill him. So they put a plot together to have him stoned. Paul and Barnabas heard about it, and they got out of town. But if you're here last week, you know that's not what happened. They didn't get out of town. In fact, it says that persecution rose, and what did they do? Anybody remember? They stayed. It's the first time it changes. The narrative up until now is just what I said. Persecution starts, they leave town. For the first time, this happened in Damascus with Paul, happened in Jerusalem with Paul, happened in Pisidian Antioch with Paul. It's happening again now in Iconium, but this time it changes. This time persecution rises, and the very next thing the historian Luke tells us is so they stayed a while. They invest deeply in this church, and somehow they avoid the persecution that will eventually, or that in their minds might take their life. It doesn't tell us how long they stayed. It just says it was for some time. That language tells us it's more than days, it's more than weeks, it's more than a season, likely around a year or so. But even still, the persecution continues to rise. And eventually it gets back to the death threats and they don't see a way around it. And so they leave. They leave and they go 20 miles south to Lystra. And that's where we pick up today. Acts 14, verse 8. In Lystra, there sat a man who was lame. They had been that way from birth. He had been that way from birth, and he had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked directly at him, saw that he had faith to be healed. I'll stop right there for a second. First, I think it's interesting that Luke, the historian, as he's recording this moment in the missionary journey of Paul, that he takes a second and he gives us this insight. He says, hey, there was a man who was lame. Everyone who's reading understands what lame means. But then he follows it up and says, and he's been that way from birth. Got it? Okay, that's another good detail. But then he triples down on it and says, he's never walked, right? He's lame from birth. That means he's never walked. Now, what's interesting about this is that Paul is teaching. He's having a conversation. It's not a conversation. He's talking. They're listening. And as he scans the crowd, somehow he locks eyes with this guy who is lame from birth, who's never walked. And what does it say? It says he sees that he has the faith to be healed. How do you see that? You ever had someone that looks at you and it's like, man, it feels like they're peering through my soul kind of thing? I don't know if that was what Paul's doing, but for sure he's like looking at this guy, and in his soul's just stirring this idea of this guy's got enough faith to be healed. I want to pause here for a second because this is significant. What's happening as we continue to read the historian Luke's account of the early church is we're starting to see a new pattern of behavior and interaction with people. Something that's very different than when we read the Jesus narratives. When we read the life about Jesus or the teachings about Jesus, we see Jesus doing incredible things, right? But we see him just things, it's like, man, only the Son of God can do that. But there's been something that has shifted in the way that Paul is approaching his own ministry that's even different from his first time in Damascus, or the first time he teaches in Jerusalem, or the first time they go to Cyprus on the east side of the island. There's just something happening. And it's these moments that can only be explained by God's doing something we can't see. Now, if you're a student of Bible study, immediately maybe your brain is going to, didn't Jesus talk about someone that would come after him that would be a guide and a comforter? Someone that was so strong, the very presence of God. The early Christians described this feeling, this movement, this spirit. But they couldn't give us details about how they could tell the difference between when the Spirit of God seemed to be doing something and when it was just like, I had a burrito for lunch. Like, what's the difference? How do I know? They don't give us that tangible evidence. We see the result of them following these movements in their soul. We fast forward 2,000 years and we'll just kind of chop this up to, it was the Holy Spirit moving. It's so much bigger than just it was the Holy Spirit moving. No, this was a new way to be human. This was unlike anything anyone in the world had ever seen before. Paul is teaching, and the Spirit of God moves in him so that this statement could be true. I saw that he had the faith to be healed. That's unlike anything people had experienced before. So what happened? Back half of verse 9. Paul looked directly at him, saw that he had the faith to be healed, and called out, stand up on your feet. At that, the man jumped up and began to walk. Shut up! That's what happened. Now think about this. Think about this for a second. I don't know what it feels like to be lame from birth, to have never walked. I don't know what that feels like. I also know what it feels like when you feel your legs for the first time, right? Like the very first time you're like, oh, those things are moving. I don't know. I don't know if it was tingly. You know what I'm talking about? Sometimes you sit kind of weird, and then it's like, it wasn't that, because you can't jump when you know what I'm talking about? You're kind of walking around like, man, I don't even know if I got a heel. I can't feel my heel hit the floor. You know what I'm saying? You can hear it, but you can't feel it, that kind of thing. For sure, that's what it says. It says he looks at him and says, get up. And the guy jumps up. How do you know how to jump? It jumps up. This is undeniable. It's public. No one can say, oh, it didn't happen like that. No, it was the guy that we've seen from birth who's lame, who's never walked. Why did he say that? Because people were going to chalk this up to like, oh, it was a parlor trick. Why does Luke, the historian, give us those three details in succession? Because he wants to make sure you know the only way this works is God made it work. There is no other explanation. So I'm going to tell you 3 times. He was lame from birth. He's never walked, and he jumped up. The crowd reacts, I don't know, probably like I would have reacted. They lose it. Verse 11. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in Lycaonian, that's their native language, The gods have come down to us in human form. Barnabas they called Zeus. Paul they called Hermes because he was the chief speaker. So immediately they're like, shut, people, the gods are among us. You know, that makes sense though. It makes sense. How else are they going to explain it? How else are they going to explain it? It's what you and I do already. Anytime we experience anything, we fit it into our worldview we are already familiar with. So they see something they can't explain. Their worldview is, I know a guy, Zeus. I mean, I don't know him, but I read about him. We got a temple just outside the gate. We sacrifice bulls to him out there. We know Hermes. Hermes was the mouthpiece of the gods. Paul's doing all the talking. That must be him. Barnabas is older. He's the mentor. Got a little gray in his beard. What's wrong with gray in your beard? I don't know. I think it's fine. He must be Zeus, the father figure. They're pumped. The thing is, it's not that far-fetched. There was a Roman poet who lived 43 BC to 17 AD. He wrote a work entitled Metamorphosis. And in book 8 of Metamorphosis, he tells an old Phrygian legend. Now, Lystra, which is the city that they're in, is part of that greater region of Phrygia. And so this would have been a well-known work that had circulated, probably stories they had told their children. And Ovid tells the story of Zeus and Hermes coming to earth. They come to earth and they put on these normal, regular clothes. And they disguise themselves, they've got hoods on, and they go door to door. And at every door, they ask everyone who comes to the door, hey, we need some food. We need a place to stay. And over again, they were rejected. People were like, no, dude, we don't let strangers into our house, especially like hooded ones, you know what I'm saying? Like, we're not doing that, you know? And so they go house to house, and nobody lets them in until they get to this one elderly couple who's incredibly poor. They answer the door, and they're like, hey, we're hungry, and we would like a place to stay. And the elderly couple decides, okay, we don't have much, we'll give you what you have. So they bring them in, and they give them out of their, running out supplies. They give them a place to stay, and then they reveal themselves. This is what the Roman poet says, that Zeus and Hermes blessed the elderly couple who didn't have much and turned their little cottage into this grand temple. And then for everyone that rejected them, he destroyed them. So when Paul and Barnabas are teaching and this miracle happens, immediately they're like, it's our turn. Do not screw this up, people. Don't screw this up. We've read about this in children's stories. There's no chance. Zeus, Hermes, fits the bill, gray beard. He's a guy who talks a lot. This is exactly what Odin was talking about. This is what Odin was talking about. It makes sense. Acts 14, verse 13. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. And so they got these bulls. I don't know, everybody reads the Bible and we think it just happens like this, right? But think about it. They do this miracle, like that's a thing. And then they start celebrating. At some point, the priest has to leave the party or someone has to go tell him. He then has to gather up a couple bulls. I don't know how long that takes. Never gathered up 2 bulls. I don't know if you can lead 2 bulls on a leash. Like, come on, let's go this way. I don't know. But he's got 2 bulls and wreaths. I don't know if he made the wreaths or he bought some wreaths on Pinterest. I'm not sure, but he got some wreaths. He's got some bulls. He's going to put the wreaths on the new gods. He's going to sacrifice the bulls to the gods that are now there with them. He's got a plan. And he is walking up to the city gate as all of this takes place. Archaeologists have found inscriptions and temples dedicated to Zeus in and around the city of Lystra. Zeus's temple was just outside the city gate, and we found that. Paul and Barnabas are watching this happen. This is their reaction. Verse 14. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God." Tearing your clothes as a Jewish man is a sign of grief. And so he's tearing his clothes. He's not like, "Oh, no, you got it wrong." There's something happening inside of him that's moving him to a place not of, "Hey guys, chill," but to, "My heart is now broken because of the way you've responded to what I did." You see, this whole time, when Paul takes that zealousness that he takes from stopping the church to planting churches, the thing that he's come to know is that the world that he's walking into, they honor and celebrate and admire and worship these false gods. And these false gods then enslave them into a way of life that ultimately will dehumanize them. Because at the end, did you see how he characterizes it? He said, "I've got good news, but I want you to turn from things that are worthless." He's saying, look, here's the deal. I know in your mind, you think that all of these gods have so much value and worth, but I'm telling you, Ovid wrote a poem for the Roman Empire about Zeus and Hermes to entertain you. He just made it up, people. And before Ovid, the people who invented Zeus and Hermes, they needed an explanation for, why do the seasons change? Why does it rain sometimes and it doesn't? Well, we haven't invented the idea of precipitation yet, and so it must be a god. There must be a god who's turning on the water up there somewhere. They needed an explanation. And so they created these explanations that then, once they had the gods, well, the gods had to have expectations. Because if there is someone that you can pray to, and I want it to rain, well, when I do these things and it doesn't rain, well, we scratch that off the list. If I do these things and it does rain, well, that's now law. Every time we want it to rain, we must do these things. I don't know what they do when they do those things again and it still doesn't rain. But that's the idea. They create expectations and rituals, and now they've got an entire religion because they're trying to explain why it rains and why it doesn't, why my wife gets pregnant and why she doesn't, why the crops grow great or why they don't. And this is the explanation. And so Paul he's like, I'm trying to share with you. Remember what he says? He says, I'm trying to share with you the good news. So you don't have to give your life to things that are worthless anymore. But the first time you see something that you can't explain, you go to your default. I bet that Zeus guy, he could do something like this. And so Paul tears his clothes because he's asking the question, what have I done? I was supposed to stop things like this, not move people away from doing these things. But now I've done something that's caused people to do these things. And so he's pleading with them. Don't do this. I'm just like you. We're just human too, is what he says. But Paul moves from just, hey, let me tear my clothes. He begins to teach them a bit. Now, up until this time, when Paul goes into a city, he finds a Jewish center of faith. In these cities, they would have been called synagogues. There's no synagogue mentioned in the journey to Lystra. Doesn't mean there wasn't one, just means that there wasn't one that Luke was recording. It also is pretty evident in the reaction to the people, because if he was teaching a predominantly Jewish audience and he did a miracle, their reaction wouldn't have been, I bet you're Zeus and he's Hermes. That would have never been the idea from a Jewish audience. His audience isn't Jewish, though, this time. He's gone into a city where there's very little, if any, Jewish presence. And so he begins to teach them here to explain it. He doesn't go through his typical Jewish message, which starts with Abraham and a promise, which continues with Moses and deliverance, which is strengthened by David and conquering, and completed by Jesus, the new David, an answer to all promises given, both to David, Moses, and Abraham. If he were to tell that story of the Jewish heritage, the people there would have been like, who's David? What's a Moses? And what is Abraham? They would have had no idea. So when he gets ready to talk to them, notice his message is so different. We pick up in verse 18. Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. He said, look, I know you got an answer for all these things. Let me tell you, those answers are dead because you thought them up. I have a living God who's actually responsible for those things. Verse 16. In the past, he let all nations go their own way. Yet he has not left himself without testimony. He says, look, for a long time, he allowed you to make up your own things, but that doesn't mean he hasn't had things bearing witness to who he is. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy. Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. Paul's a quick thinker, and so he's like, okay, how do I get these people to understand Moses? No, they don't know who Moses is. Shoot, what do they know? Crops, rain. Yeah, I got it. Okay, God made the rain. God did the crops. He's thinking, okay, not only did he provide the rain and the crops, he gave a joy. The thing that fills your hearts. He's trying. He's like, let me speak in things that you're aware of. Let me try to identify with the audience that I'm talking to. You want an explanation? I'll give you an explanation. God's creator. But even still, even as they hear these things, they're hearing the gods they presume to be say, no, those gods don't exist. They're actually not living. They're dead. And they're worthless. And even still, the people are like, no, slash that bull's throat. We're about to sacrifice to these bad boys. That's what's happening. And the whole time, Paul's just like, I don't know how to get through to you. Paul's heart the whole time has been pretty simple. I've become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. This is an example of that. This is a moment in Paul's life where he's fleshing that out. Though in this particular instance, it doesn't seem to be working. And then we get to verse 19. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. You gotta be kidding me. These are the Jewish leaders that were at not Syrian Antioch, not the church that was growing and great. This is Pisidian Antioch, right? In Pisidia, back up, still in Turkey. The guys that ran them off, that tried to put together an execution for Paul, they then followed him to Iconium. Iconium leadership also ran him off, even after he had been there for a long time, attempted to stone him. Both times they get out just before that happens. They have followed him now from Pisidian Antioch to Iconium. They have now followed him to Lystra. And they're in the crowd. And they're like, look, guys, they're telling you the truth. They are not Zeus and Hermes. But they also don't have a living God because their Messiah, their Savior, he was crucified. Who's ever heard of a crucified Messiah? Nobody. It's just a bunch of baloney. And they win the crowd over. And the crowd realizes, oh, shoot. Them Iconium, Pisidian Antioch guys, they're right. That's not Zeus and Hermes. It's a bunch of frauds. And this is the hard part. You know, you only get away with it so long. You only just miss it so many times. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. The same people that just a few minutes ago were slaughtering their bulls and placing wreaths on their heads. And now, there's a couple ways you stone people in the first century. You either back them up against a wall and kind of half moon, kind of encircle them so they couldn't go anywhere, or you had enough people to fully encircle them. And when we say stoning them, it was a form of capital punishment, though not typically governmental punishment, typically religious. And so I'm not saying that they would get like little pebbles. I'm saying they would go find like baseball size, softball size stones, and they would get the individual where they couldn't escape. Because for sure, I mean, if you see a bunch of people about to throw like stones at you, you try to like run through them, like there's none of that. Even if you did try, all it takes is one person when you're 4 foot from them to hit you in the face with a rock the size of a baseball. And you realize, yeah, I'm probably not getting out of here. The first one that hits you, your natural instinct is to put your hands up. And when you throw a rock of that size from 4 or 5 feet away, the fingers that try to stop that stone, they break. And so that's when excruciating pain starts. And your reaction then is to huddle into a ball. And then they get closer and closer, and they'll reuse the stones until they have torn your flesh from your face and punctured your lungs to where you're gasping for air. And they watch the blood drain from you. And then once you're dead, they drag you outside the city so that wild animals, typically wild dogs, would devour you. If your family was bold enough, they might go collect your body, but there's a chance that they would convict them in the same thing. So sometimes families just let them lie. And that's what happened to Paul. Evidently, there was a rock that hit him pretty early and knocked him unconscious. And he had bled out enough to convince people who had done this before, oh, this guy's dead. I don't know what it was like to watch that happen as Barnabas. Like, what would that be like for one of your best friends? Honestly, someone that you were responsible for recruiting to do this whole thing. Go through that. Like, doesn't tell us Barnabas tried to step in. Maybe Barnabas was afraid, or maybe they held him. I don't know. After they dragged his body outside the city, it does tell us that the disciples went to it. What was it like for the followers of Jesus to walk towards Paul's presumably dead body? I mean, as you're walking, like you're passing the blood where they drug him, and you're walking towards it wondering, are they watching? Are they going to care if I show compassion to him? And are they right behind us? What was it like for that city where new believers had just started in their faith? Because the folks from Pisidian Antioch and from Iconium, they didn't change everyone's mind just enough to get the stoning done. So what was it like for those who had just given their life to following Jesus to watch the guy that had shared with them the good news about Jesus lose his life for talking about Jesus? What does that do to their faith? Like, immediately I begin to wrestle with, if you're telling us about a living God, why did he just let you get killed? That seems odd. Verse 20. But after the disciples had gathered around him, he got up and went back into the city. The next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe. So they gather around him, and all of a sudden, I don't know who it is, it's like, hey, he's breathing. And I don't know if Paul I don't know what he looks like. But at some point, Paul gets enough strength to stand up. And I'm sure there's someone well-versed in medical training in that crew that's like, hey, excuse me, sir, you probably need to lay down. This is not a good time to be walking around. You stay down, get one of them stretchers, hook you up to IV. We'll put some heart sensors on you, the one that pulls your chest hair off. You know what I'm talking about? Love those. That's what we need to do. Paul gets up. And then he has this decision to make. If it was me, I'd probably be like, hey, let's say Jeremy's there, like, Jeremy, can we find a lake house? I don't want to go back in the city. You know what I'm saying? I need to rest a little bit. You got a place other than in that city I can go to? But Luke says Paul gets up and he looks at the gate his body was just drugged through, and he walks back through it. I don't know if he thought people would be waiting for the second act or if he was just like, I'm going to go sit down. I don't know. The next day, they set out to go to the next city, which was 60 miles from the city they were currently in Lystra. Paul's use me prayer, evidently it doesn't stop when it hurts. Like, his use me prayer wasn't just use me when things are easy. It wasn't just use me when I get to wear an Easter dress and everybody's happy. It wasn't just use me when we get to go to Christmas Eve gatherings. It wasn't just use me on special days when my grandson gets baptized. It wasn't just use me when they're giving away free t-shirts. It wasn't just use me when I got a great place to park and it was close to the door. It wasn't just use me when, hey, my schedule was completely open and why not? I was just gonna sit there and scroll through my phone anyway, I'll go serve somewhere. It wasn't just use me then, it was just use me. In fact, I think Paul might have even just changed it. It says, use all of me, use me up. And there was nothing about hard times that made him say, hey, pause, I don't like this no more. There's nothing about arguably one of the most difficult moments in his life where he was like, no, I signed up for something different. I signed up for Easter gatherings and Christmas Eve gatherings. That's the kind of church I like. I signed up for Sundays when it doesn't rain. No, Paul is saying, I remember Ananias when he came and talked with me. I remember that day that I gave my life to Jesus. And Ananias walked in that house on Straight Street, the house of Judas, back in Damascus. I remember that day. And I remember I couldn't see anything. And I remember this voice, and he says, hey, I'm Ananias, and I'm a follower of Jesus, and I was led here to come pray for you. I remember him laying hands on me, and I remember something like scales fell out of my eyes, and I could see again. And I remember that moment, and I remember Ananias having this puzzled look on his face because he shared with me something that God had shared with him about me. He shared with me that hey, I actually didn't want to come over here and do this because I was scared of you, because you lock up people like me, and honestly, you killed Stephen because he believed what I believe. I remember what he said because he said, hey, God told me that he was going to use you. But Ananias shared something so strange. So strange. And this isn't something that everyone has been given, but for Paul in particular, you see, God told Ananias, I'm going to show him how much he has to suffer for me. And I don't know what Paul thought when Ananias shares this with him. But I bet as Paul is picking up his snot-filled, bloody face off the desert dirt of Lystra, that he's remembering, well, Jesus, you told me it wasn't going to be easy. Keep using me. Where's the gate to the city? Let me wipe the blood from my eyes. There it is. Let's go back in. That's different. That's different. There's a teenager living in Lystra at the time. Somewhere between the age of 15 and 20. His mother's name was Eunice. His grandmother's name was Lois. His father was Greek. Doesn't look like he was a follower of Jesus or of Jehovah or Jewish at all. But Eunice and Lois were. They were Jewish. We don't know if this teenager witnessed the stoning. We just know he lived in the city when it happened. I'm not sure how you could miss it. But who knows? He might have been playing Xbox upstairs when it took place. I don't know. You know what first century teenagers do. But there is no doubt that he learned about it, that he heard about it. Because Eunice and Lois were some of the people that gave their lives to Jesus. So what was it like for people to witness the person that brought them to good news be executed and dragged outside the city, left for dead? For Lois and Eunice, it stirred something in them that they would not shake. And they passed it down to their son and their grandson. This is Paul's first missionary journey. 2 chapters from now, in Acts chapter 16, Paul comes back in his second missionary journey. And when he's there, everyone's speaking so highly of this young guy. So much so that Paul meets him and invites him to continue the missionary journey with him as an assistant, as an understudy. This kid goes on to be one of Paul's most trusted co-laborers in the faith. Paul trusts him so much, he sends him to Corinth, one of the most wild cities in all the Roman Empire. Vegas on steroids. Doesn't just send him there, sends him to a city called Thessalonica to help with the church there. Sends him to a place called Ephesus for the Ephesian church. In fact, this guy ends up growing into the leader of the church in Ephesus. We have 2 letters still today that Paul wrote to this young man. They are housed in what we know today as the New Testament. The boy's name is Timothy. The letters are 1st and 2nd Timothy. But it's not just those 2 letters where Timothy plays a pretty significant role. Let me just show you just how big a deal Timothy becomes. This is what Paul is credited for writing in our Bible. There's 27 books in the New Testament. Paul wrote the following: Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and it's debated whether or not he's the author of Hebrews. We'll put Hebrews on the list, though, just to make the next point. The orange are the books that Timothy's mentioned in. Timothy is mentioned in more books in the New Testament than Peter. What I'm trying to say is Paul's pain produced quite the legacy. Paul's pain initiated something in Lois and Eunice that they passed down to their son and grandson, so that a couple years later on Paul's second missionary journey, not only did he go and become an understudy, he plays such a significant role in so much of what we see and have as our New Testament in the Bible, that his name mentioned in terms of books surpasses that of even Peter and John. Other than Jesus and Paul, he's the next guy in terms of how many books he's mentioned in. It's wild. One of the books he's not mentioned in, Ephesians, he actually puts Ephesians to practice because he goes and leads that church. He's not mentioned in Ephesians, but he leads the church in Ephesians with the letter. Timothy's all over the place. Now, here's the hard part. Our ability to handle adversity teaches those who watch from up close as well as far away how to follow Jesus. The truth is, sometimes your scars are the very thing God uses to grow someone else's faith. That's a pretty good legacy. Church, you never know who's watching and learning to become like Jesus by the way you suffer. You never know who's watching and learning to become more like Jesus by the way that you suffer. Jesus tells a story. Two builders. Both builders build a house that represents their life. One builds his house on the rock, one on the sand. Both people suffer. The winds come, the rains pour, and the water rises on both of them. One life survives, and the other doesn't. Connection to Jesus is not disconnection from suffering. It's preparation for it. It's admitting, if my prayer is going to be make me God, and that can mature into use me God, suffering is coming. It is a part of life. And it's our suffering as followers of Jesus that oftentimes can awaken something significant in those who are watching, even though at the time we don't know their name. But the truth is, God does know their name, and He sees their story. And that's part of our prayer, to be used through difficult times, not to fake it like we're strong, not to pretend like we've got it all together, but to be authentic and genuine and submissive to the will of God, to the desires He has for us, and be willing to take on the hardship and the hard moments. Not and pretend it's nothing, to acknowledge it for what it is, but to pick ourselves up out of the dust, find the gate to the city that just destroyed us, and walk back towards it. Our mission statement here ends with this simple phrase, and Jesus is in the lead. Does He want me to suffer? No. Did He desire for Paul to be stoned? No. Will He lead us through suffering? Did He lead Paul through stoning? Yes. Church, we got to expect stones to be thrown. We've got to anticipate they're going to hurt. We've got to acknowledge they might knock us into the ground. But when we get back up, it's not to end them. It's not to put them in their place. It's simply to lead them to Jesus. Scars and all. That's the kind of church we have to continue to be. Scar-filled, love-led, just like Jesus.